The train is departing, but we've only just begun. Hey everybody, it's Steve! And I just got off the Max from another day at work. So I figure, what better time to bring to you today's story? I knew there was a reason I had my selfie stick with me today. It's April 16th, 2021. And you know what that means? Oh, I thought I was gonna fade into darkness behind this RV. Means a new day, a new story. Now my face goes dark, of course. But before we get to that, remember as always to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon. All those things that help a little channel like mine grow and blossom like a flower in the springtime, which we're in springtime, so it makes sense. The link to my Patreon is in the description below, as well as the links to my Facebook and Instagram pages closely related to the content that I'm posting both here, as well as my main channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. Go give it a sub over there if you haven't yet. All that said, today's story is a story of hubris. You know, when people get real high and mighty, so much so that they say some real dumb stuff that ends up coming back, and nobody likes you. Your mother hates you. Wow, was that me? I hate people that do that. Like, get a life. Your existence is sad and tragic if you're doing that, especially it's almost midnight. Nobody's paying attention to you. Everybody's trying to relax. They don't want to hear you blowing their eardrums out at the end of the day. Get a life. Anyway, how y'all doing? So for our story, we're going back to the mid-1930s. And this is a Portland-based story. And as a little bit of a context, as far as Portland during this time, Portland was a place that during its earlier decades, the 1850s mostly up till the end of the 1880s, and then they started going a new direction, primarily with architecture, but most Portland buildings built during the city's really first 35 years were cast iron structures, and they were beautiful. A lot of them still stand. Portland has a surprisingly good number of cast iron structures, considering they used to be prominent all over the country, but there's only a few areas where they're really still of prominence. And what's so tragic, because there'd be these beautiful images along Front Avenue and First Avenue, and the streets would just be lined with these massive cast iron structures, pretty much all of which are gone. There's a few still lingering around in that area, like the Smith Block, things like that. And it didn't really start hitting its stride till the 1940s, and it kind of went on into the 1970s, but there was this just string of cast iron structures that got torn down. A lot of them were their usage was kind of fading, and a lot of them were just kind of sitting predominantly vacant. And there's a mentally ill person over here. So I'm going another way. I'm not dealing with, I'm sorry. It's almost midnight. There's a guy sitting at the bus stop right dead ahead of me over there that was just screaming. I'm just ah! Yeah, I just heard him again. You probably didn't. It was very faint, but I'm just I'm not dealing with that. So I'm cutting through the hospital parking lot. I keep hearing it. Anyway, so again, it really didn't pick up steam till the 1940s, but a lot of these buildings started getting torn down. They were battered. They were kind of a blight on the city. And of course, leading into the 1950s and into the 1960s, a lot of urban renewal was done in the Portland area, and a lot more places disappeared. But we're still, mid-30s, we're still kind of in the earlier days of, looking at a lot of buildings and thinking that one's crap, they all need to go. And then finally by the 1970s, people in the city started realizing these architectural structures are beautiful, and we've just generations before us have just torn a bunch of them down. What are we thinking? No, we need to be, these are beautiful structures, and they're built to last unless they catch fire. A lot of cast iron structures in the past went down because they caught fire at some time or another. But In particular, that's what we were dealing with. In 1935, the city was trying to get rid of a lot of so-called fire traps, as they were referenced in this piece that I read. In essence, you know, these buildings that were just, you know, they'd either been vacant for a long time or they were falling apart. Maybe transients were kind of living in and out of them, and they were just sitting there just asking for somebody. Wow, that was an interesting effect. Everything got real heavenly for a second there on my camera. But a lot of these places became, you know, fire traps. You know, a homeless person could move in there, build a fire, torch the whole building. And who's to say you burn that building down, you don't burn the building that's right next to you? So then enters Portland Fire Chief P.J. Shepard. Was Portland's fire chief back in 1935, and he was examining a lot of buildings in the area to make sure that if they were kind of run down, those who owned them would bring them back up to code, or, you know, I guess adjust to new regulations and get these buildings to a place where they weren't going to potentially be fire traps. And again, so many buildings had burned down in Portland's past, not just cast iron buildings, but you've got there were two massive fires that happened in 1872 and 1873, less than a year apart. So Portland was no stranger, especially the downtown area, to having lots of fires happen. So I can understand the push. And, you know, most of these buildings in downtown were owned, you know, privately, or they were owned by the businesses, or at least one of the businesses that presided in them. So you'd see a building that was a little run down, you'd contact, you know, this person who owns it, that person who owns it. And as the fire chief, you know, you're working for the city. So in the midst of his investigation and, you know, looking into various properties, somewhere along Front Avenue, they don't say exactly where, but along Front Avenue, Shepard stopped and took notice of two buildings that to him were pretty run down and definitely qualified as, quote, fire traps. He has, you know, a collection of people with him. He's probably feeling very important. I'm the fire chief and I'm going to make this city safer, and I'm going to call out all of these people that aren't bringing their buildings up to code, so to speak. So he sees these two rundown buildings along Front Avenue and turns to someone who's working with him. I don't know, his assistant, co-worker, the co-fire chief, I don't know. And he says, look at these fire traps. Who owns these buildings? And his assistant glances at the paperwork, you know, looks at the buildings, looks at the addresses, looks at his paperwork and says, well, sir, these two buildings belong to the city. And here's Shepard working for the city. You know, it's almost like you go to work and you're, you know, let's say you're working in a movie theater, you know, like I've done in the past. And I, you know, an employee come in and I see that there's like this big mess that's been like spilled onto the floor. And I'm like, who did this? Who made this mess? This is an eyesore. A customer's gonna come in and trip on it. And then someone walks up to me and is like, hey, your boss, you know, in our case, a GM, general manager of the theater, he just accidentally spilled his lunch and he went off to get something to clean it. He'll be back in a couple of minutes. It's like, oh, my boss did this. That was kind of the situation that Shepard was in when he says, what are these eyesores? And then he finds out that the city, you know, run by personnel that put him in his position as fire chief, were the ones that owned these buildings. So even those above the fire chief were not cooperating in his effort to make buildings more safe and to make fires in them less common. I think it's funny. You know, it's some kind of old man humor. He thought he was going to call him out and he thought it was a city. Like, fine. But, you know, it was this fun little article, just, you know, off to the side in a newspaper. And I thought, you know, when a guy has got a pretty cushiony position like fire chief, sometimes these people get a little too cocky, they get a little too high and mighty, and they start talking out their ass. I mean, pretty much. And, you know, sometimes you go off half-cocked, and you end up embarrassing yourself, and you end up calling out unintentionally the very people that put you in your position for not following the regulations you want. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, would you like me to jump off of this bridge or this bridge, sir? Because there's no coming back from this. I don't think the guy got in any trouble, but I thought it was just one of those funny little stories about someone, you know, get a little ahead of themselves, putting the cart before the horse, and unintentionally walking into a minefield and looking like a real idiot. And it addresses, again, you know, on the other side, the earliest period where the city started condemning a lot more buildings and tearing down a lot of these gorgeous structures that were unfortunately just sitting there, you know, rotting away and not being used. Because, you know, we look at it from our time and we think, oh, these beautiful buildings, you know, they were built in the 1870s and 1880s, and these beautiful, meticulously crafted structures. But when it's the 1930s and you're looking back at these buildings, it's not a whole lot different than someone from today looking back at a building that was built in the 60s. And you think, like, it's not that big of a deal, it's not that old of a building. And that was, you know, the unfortunate truth was that, you know, the city just didn't realize and didn't appreciate what they had with these beautiful structures. And to them, these were just eyesores. They were vacant, nobody wanted them. They were making the waterfront look like trash, and they wanted them to either get fixed up or gotten rid of. And unfortunately, a lot of them were gotten rid of. You know, the waterfront is, at least on the east side where Waterfront Park is, it's wide open today. It used to be lined with gorgeous buildings that unfortunately, for the most part, were destroyed. There's still a few along the west side of, well, what is now NATO Parkway, but was, you know, where Front Avenue would have been. There's still a few old buildings there, but, you know, 90% of them are gone, unfortunately. So there's that early history of that. These are the early days of them going into this phase where, like, over the course of like 30, 35 years, so many beautiful buildings disappeared in downtown Portland. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for what we still have, but it's unfortunate. And this fire chief, I don't know, maybe he was a major force behind getting that momentum going. And in that case, you're a jackass twice over. But I don't know, I didn't know the guy, I never met him. He's probably dead before I was born. But anyway, it's just, you know, a story that's kind of funny. Someone having to eat a little bit of humble pie, acting a little too big for their britches. God, I'm using a lot of old man talk tonight. But I'm just trying to get home, you know, and bring you a funny little story along the way with a little dose of history to it. So I hope you enjoyed it for what it was worth, today's video. It's very cold, just a lot of going on out in the world. So thank you so much. If you made it all the way through the video, I applaud you, because I kind of rambled a little bit in this one, but there was a lot of external information that kind of makes a little more sense of why this particular stuff being addressed in this article was actually going on at that time. So truly, from the heart, I appreciate you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting my channel. And of course, as always, remember to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon, all the little things that help my channel grow. Constantly posting new stuff on my Patreon to give you bang for your buck. The link to my Patreon is in the description below, as well as the links to my Instagram and Facebook pages closely related to the content that I'm posting both here, as well as my primary YouTube channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. If you haven't subscribed there yet, get on over there and do it. You won't be sorry. And I'm saying that objectively. All that said, I'm very cold and I need to get home. So, this has been Steve, and I'll see you tomorrow.